Dia go córide, go mí maithagah is violin, agus fáilte romh go léir. Hello and welcome, and thank you so much everyone for joining us here online for the CIFF at Home series tonight, presented in partnership with NYU DC Dialogues here in Washington, DC. My name is Maedhbh McCullagh. I am the director of the Solas Nua's Capital Irish Film Festival and our CIFF at Home screening series. This evening, we're so privileged to be joined by the acclaimed multi-award-winning Irish filmmaker, director and writer, Alan Gilsenan. He's created an iconic body of work over the last 35 years that encompasses documentary, feature film, and experimental film, including The Road to God Knows Where, Timbuktu, The Asylum, Eliza Lynch, The Queen of Paraguay. And his most recent films include The Days of Trees, the third film in a trilogy that includes the groundbreaking The Meeting and Meetings with Ivor, and most recently The United Irishmen, exploring the lasting legacy of the Age of Revolution in Ireland. At last year's festival, you'll remember Solas Nua presented a screening of Ghosts of Bagatonia, which was Alan's rich and evocative love letter to Dublin and to the mid-century Bohemian quarter in Dublin's Baggot Street area. We're so excited to announce that Alan will be screening another of his films with us at the festival, and we'll come back to more on that later. But first of all, I just want to say, Alan, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I know you're very busy. We're delighted to have you here.
Thanks, Maeve. Delighted to be with you here in my area in the Wicklow Mountains, just south of Dublin. So lovely to join you. I've admired what Solas does for many years from afar. So great to be with you tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So hopefully most of our viewers tonight will have watched the documentary, The 7 Ages of Noël Browne. But for anyone who's tuning in tonight that may have not seen the documentary yet, they have the link. It would be wonderful just to give people an introduction to who Noël Browne was. You and I obviously would know about him very much from being from Ireland, but just for our viewers here that may not have already watched the film.
Yeah, Maeve, I mean, Noël was an extraordinary man, you know, in many ways ahead of his time in a quite profound way. But he was born into a very kind of poor family in the west of Ireland who were struck down by TB at the height of that terrible, I guess, pandemic across Ireland. And he, through a twist of fate, ended up doing medicine in Trinity College. Kind of very long, very tragic family story, but through the kindness of strangers, he ended up studying medicine and went on to become a kind of fairly radical Minister for Health in the government here. He was very young, but he stood up particularly for women's rights and stood against the church. You know, he's often kind of slightly misrepresented as this kind of angry young man, but in actual fact, in many ways, he was respectful, I think, of the church and of authority, but believed in his beliefs, which were way ahead of his time, that Irish women particularly were neglected, were second-class citizens, and that the church was implicit in that. And he led this extraordinary mother and baby scheme, which was way ahead of its time, as I say, in terms of bringing free healthcare for women and their children, which the church stood firmly against under, you know, the, I guess, notorious John Charles McQuaid, the Archbishop of Dublin at the time, who was a very conservative Catholic, who didn't like the idea of, you know, the state in the name of Noël Browne, Minister for Health, kind of entering into the medical sphere, entering into how women were represented. So a kind of radical, very maverick figure in Irish life, who in some ways, and I'm sure we'll come to this, has been largely forgotten for some time.
Yeah. I could see that. I mean, I remember when his book came out, he did his memoir. I want to say it was in the early 90s, maybe it was the late 80s, Against the Tide.
Yeah.
but I hadn't seen any major documentary on him at all. And, you know, always was interested in his story and, you know, had a reverence for him and what he had tried to do in Ireland and what he did do actually through all of his work. Um, if we start with the film, so it's a really interesting place to be as a filmmaker, to come across someone else's recordings and interviews. Can you tell us how you came to come into contact with the James Black recordings that form the basis of the documentary?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we were talking before, you know, both our fathers, I think, had a great admiration for Noël Browne, and you know, you know, my father was quite a conservative Catholic man, so it was always interesting that he was so drawn to this figure. And I remember distinctly when Against the Tide, the memoir you mentioned, came out, I think probably in the late 80s. And interestingly, when I was making the documentary, somebody told me that it was the best-selling, even to this day, Irish memoir of its time. So I'd kind of always had this kind of vague respect for Noël Browne. I remember the book in the house and his kind of radical left-wing views. And then when I was very young, at the age of 21, I'll answer your question in a minute.
Yeah, no,
I made a film, Road to God Knows Where, which was kind of my little angry young man statement. And I got a lovely letter from Noël Browne, handwritten letter. He didn't know me at all, just saying how much he admired the film. And I remember as a young filmmaker, I was 21 or something, you know, that meant a huge amount, that this figure that I only knew from afar. Anyway, many, many years later, a wonderful woman called Nuala Suchet, who's an Irish woman living in London, approached me with a feature film script, which was about Noël Browne. And as we discussed it, she revealed a kind of extraordinary, if sad, story, in that her late husband, James Black, who had been a kind of Irish filmmaker from Belfast, kind of very successful, dynamic producer director with the BBC. And he had come across Noël in his 50s and thought this was an extraordinary, wanted to make a feature film. So he'd written this wonderful script. And as part of his research for the script, he did a long, long interview with Noël Browne in his house in Connemara. And I guess because he was used to making documentaries, he also filmed it, though I don't think he ever intended the filmed interview to be used. Anyway, tragically, James, in his mid-50s, very soon after, developed rapid onset sort of Alzheimer's or dementia, Pick's disease, I think it's called. Very tragic. You know, he's this I've seen the photographs, this really kind of dashing, he kind of like an Irish kind of James Bond, you know, he was kind of hanging out of helicopters, and very wonderful man, even though I've never met him. But James went downhill. The disease was very rapid, and eventually died, you know, very sadly. But Nuala, true to his legacy, came to me with the script, which I liked. It was a very ambitious project. In the course of discussing it, she mentioned, kind of in passing, that of course James had conducted this lengthy interview with Noël, which had never been seen. And of course, immediately the documentary radar goes up. And we finally found the interview. It was very hard. She couldn't lay her hands on it. And it was extraordinary that James sat down in the cottage and talked through his life. And I said, well, let's make a documentary first. And so that was the origins of the film. And, you know, it was kind of interesting because I was kind of aware with James, there were certain parallels with our own life. The two of us had done similar things at similar stages. But also I was very aware in some way of his ghost, you know, that this would be a kind of this would be our film together in a way.
Which is lovely.
Anyway, so
voices in it, which is wonderful.
Yeah, I didn't want to, you know, kind of erase him from the story. You know, it's very easy. You know, us filmmakers, as you know, we're very vain and, you know, it's all about us. But I really didn't want to. I want to resist my own vanity and include James in the process. So basically, out of that, we used the interview as the basis of the story, and also then Noël Browne's two daughters, who are amazing women, and they've never, I think, talked publicly about him. You know, very kind of very like very like Noel and his mother, Noel and his wife, very much in their mode, not pulling the attention towards them. But they agreed to do, to do an extensive interview with me about their father, and so it was very kind of intimate experience, but very lovely.
Oh, you absolutely sense it. I mean, I have to say, you know, I've watched it many times now, but the first time I watched it, you know, I just wept and wept. It is so moving. The intimacy of it, of the sisters, also the juxtaposition of what they talk about his private life and his public life really comes through in the structure of the documentary. But I'd love to start with the opening of the documentary. For me, the way it starts with the Late Late Show, it begins with the public apology of a caller on the Late Late Show. Before then, you know, you move to Clockmore in Ballinahone, Connemara. And I love that choice. And it struck me really as important, especially knowing the story of Dr. Browne. And obviously, you know, well, not obviously, but I suppose it's the question to you. Was that important to you to set that out from the start?
Yes, I think the Late Late Show clip was very revealing. You know, it was a long interview done with Kate Byrne, again later in life.
Yeah.
And I think he had suffered. I think he was a very sensitive man. He was a strong man, but he was sensitive, and he had suffered. I think that he sort of had so much abuse hurled at him. You know, he was this communist. He was this anti-church, anti-family, anti, you know, Catholicism. And there's a woman in the phone in rings in, as you see at the start of the film, basically to say, you know, as a young woman, probably a peer maybe of Noel's daughters, you know, the nuns had warned her off him, and she later in life had seen the error of her ways and started campaigning for her. And you could see his kind of quiet appreciation of that. And I think it is because, you know, we always have to be careful that the people that conservatism tends to revile in the moment later become, you know, the people we revere. And, you know, it's interesting, as you mentioned, I also did a film with Ivor Browne, no relation, famous radical psychiatrist. And the interesting thing about Ivor, you know, in psychiatry in Dublin in the 70s and 80s, you know, everybody thought, oh, Ivor's mad himself, you know, because he had all these views like mental illness is kind of normal, and, you know, and he was kind of dismissed for that. But yet, of course, the reality was the things he was saying in the early 80s, now we take as gospel. You know, it's very interesting how
he was ahead of his time as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Now we're saying, and I think it's similar with Noel, is that what Noel is saying or was saying back, you know, in the 50s and 60s is what we think makes absolute sense now. And one of the things that interested me when the documentary was broadcast on RT, I was kind of amazed at the response. Like, there was an extraordinary response from the public, which is all down to Noel, not the film, and debates on the radio and talk about naming the new children's hospital after him, which I think would be a wonderful idea.
Yes.
And it's funny how some of these ideas can find their time. And I think it's definitely now. And also everything he's saying, you know, we made it partly during COVID, but along with the mother and child scheme that I mentioned earlier, Noel's big achievement, because many of his family died from TB, was he effectively eradicated TB in Ireland. And we were making this partly during COVID. And, you know, the parallels with Noel's life were very strong.
Well, it's amazing. Yeah, I mean, and the earlier part, you know, because I really want to go towards, you know, the sort of the crescendo moment of the, you know, the inter-party government and the collapse of the government because of the mother and child scheme. But the film, you know, so beautifully goes through his life. And I love the way you split it up into the seven sort of ages of his life. But the early years where he describes what happened to his mother and her heroic efforts to, like, his mother knew. So his mother knew that basically if she was to die, she's already a widow, if she was to die, that these children would end up in one of these institutions. Even back then in the 30s, this woman was aware of the fact that there was no social net for poorer people in Ireland, and just her efforts to get them out of Ireland and to get them to England. But then the subsequent deaths of nearly all of his family members, I believe, died from TB. The fact that you know, I love what he said. He said that he wanted to destroy the kind of system which had given so much unhappiness to his family and others' families like his. And his focus on women, children, innocent people, emigrants, unemployed, and homeless. I mean, the experiences of his life, you know, gave him this incredible drive and compassion to do what he did, but also the resilience that he had. The fact that, you know, I know as Minister for Health, his focus was on the eradication of TB, but the section in the film where you include the clip where he talks about what he did with the sweepstakes to actually generate the income to build those hospitals, that was completely radical.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. You know, as you say, his family were virtually eradicated by TB. Indeed, he had TB himself, but he recovered. And his mother, in a last kind of, you know, in a sort of dying act, moved the family to London to be with his sister, and so that had a huge effect on him. You know, he was taken in and sent to quite a kind of posh school in Britain, and then other friends took him in and paid for his training, his medical training in Trinity. But then he returned to Britain, and this was at the start of the NHS. You know, now, you know, we hear about Britain is in a kind of perpetual crisis, which we take a certain glee from, but that's another story. But, you know, the NHS in Britain is suffering. You know, the health service in Britain, public health system, you know, for Americans who mightn't know, but you know, it was the shining star of public engagement in Britain, and he was there as it, you know, as it kind of was founded. And he was hugely inspired by these hospitals that were free, that were open, that they were building. And he took all that kind of idealism back to Ireland, you know, and as Minister for Health, he really believed he could change things, you know, and he was appointed as very young, you know, in a government in the late 40s. He was appointed a very young man, very radical man, you know, probably a slightly risky appointment as a minister, you know, which I think they later regretted because he was such a radical figure. But he, you know, he was into building hospitals for Irish people, you know, that he saw no reason with our relatively small population that we couldn't have perfect, you know, healthcare.
Well, it was amazing when you think of that time, like what happened, because it also coincided with that public housing bill that happened at the same time. So, I mean, if you think from like, I remember my parents just talking about that experience of what it meant, you know, as 18-year-olds, you know, being able to go to a doctor for the first time, having medical care, being able to access that. It seemed like a natural step in the progression of developing health policy, that the next step would be, yes, a mother and child scheme is logical, considering how badly children were dealing with you know, diseases like rickets and the amount of children that were impoverished in Dublin at the time. I remember a quote that Sean McBride, and I can't say that where I got this quote, I think he said at one point he was talking about bombing Dublin with condoms because of the amount of children that were running around diseased and essentially, you know, partially homeless, living in tenements. But it was extraordinary, the pushback against the scheme, not surprisingly from the Catholic Church, but from the medical profession. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because you could understand, knowing John Charles McQuaid, knowing the Catholic Church at that time, them not wanting women to understand what was going on with their bodies, what was their biology, what happens around themselves and their motherhood, because educating them would mean that they would possibly change the nature of how they live their lives and what kind of families they have. But it was the response from the medical professional, which was really, really shocking, I think, at the time. And then obviously the two banding together. Can you talk a little bit more about that, just because you do explore it in the film?
Yeah, I was surprised about that, about the medical profession's objections to mother and child scheme, and I think it was, as you say, it was also, Ireland at the time, very small place. It was like the forces of conservatism, and women were, the secret world of women was seen as a place that you didn't want to investigate. The intimate world of childbirth, sexuality, that was something that was taboo. And I think the church liked controlling it and keeping it taboo, and contraception was part of that. Childbirth was part of that. And so I suppose on two fronts, the church objected to somehow this lay man, the government, a lay government, who really at the time, you got to remember that this is the late 40s, and really the Irish government was always doffing the cap to the Catholic hierarchy. It was like the Catholic hierarchy were here, and then the government was below them, and governing for a Catholic people.
And this was the first.
Noël Browne came.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, it's just, and this was the first.
No, I was just going.
Yeah, sorry, you go. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that Noël Browne sort of injected public policy into this world and said, the women of Ireland are entitled to these things. But to come back to the medical profession, which really surprised me, you'd presume, if this is good for healthcare, but effectively they objected to the fact that they would be losing their livelihood, their fee. That if this Browne was going to come in and this sort of communist young fellow was going to come in and give free healthcare to every mother and child in the country, that would actually affect their livelihood. And they publicly campaigned against it. And also, of course, because the medical profession, particularly then, would have been a very conservative force in Ireland. Like the government, they were part of a power cabal of men in suits who kind of believed that they knew what was best for the country, and particularly for women.
And there was also classism, right, at play there at that time. And I suppose if you think the first inter-party government was the first time that you had a shift in whether it was Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, for the first time in 25 years since the end of the Civil War. So, things were getting shaked up as it was anyway. But yeah, I feel like one of the interviews you had with him in Ballinrobe, it was really interesting. He described himself as a bitter opponent of laissez-faire capitalism and a committed socialist. And Sean McBride, in that interview clip with him, I think he hit the nail on the head in the most awful way. He said Noël Browne didn't play the game of politics, and he hadn't learned the game of politics. And the sad fact of the matter, that was part of his downfall, because basically he went to the church and said, it's not your job to tell us what to do. We're the appointed representatives of the people. We'll do what we want to do. But I think what was also shocking for me was not just the fact that the medical establishment had joined with the church. It was that this then leached out into their everyday lives. That the way he spoke about the fact that his family, they were treated like pariahs, and even the children at school were shunned.
Yeah, I think, you hit on some very important things there. One was that, he was, it seems to me that Noël was a man, he might have been a bit stubborn and hot-headed, but who isn't in that world, that he just believed in doing the right thing. And it seemed that the political classes, as you rightly say, didn't think that's how it was done. You had to kind of play the game, as you say, and he wasn't. Whereas I think, from what I've seen and learned of Noël, he was very straight. He said what he was thinking, and he tried to do what was right. And he was a socialist, and he was basically driven out of, mainstream politics, and he engaged in politics right throughout his life, returning in different parties and as an independent. And he was very consistent in his kind of generally socialist views. But you're right that basically when he resigned as Minister for Health, he was also a pariah as a doctor, So the hospitals weren't going to give him a job. He had to go and retrain in Britain as a psychiatrist because that was the only kind of angle in medicine he could get in. So the family really suffered. They moved around all the time. Money was very, very short in those days, in the days when the children were growing up. Their mother was an extraordinary figure. They described beautifully how she'd make a home anywhere. They'd move, some house, and by the evening she'd have made it feel like home. Yeah. And of course she was, she was a huge figure in Noel's life. Of course, I have a sense of this fabulous love story between the two of them, which is beautiful. But yeah, he did suffer. I mean, he really did suffer. I think later in life, when he started working as a psychiatrist, things improved a bit and there was a bit of stability. But he was very... the other thing, that people have said about him, he's often portrayed in recent years as this kind of angry, kind of slightly irrational guy who just wasn't cut out for public life. And from what I've seen and learned, that's not true. I think he was hardworking, he was truthful, he was tough, but his home life he seemed to be a very gentle, kind of fun person. And often, we all do this with public figures, we stereotype them. And, one of the lovely things about the film was learning about that other side to him, that very kind of quiet, shy, I think peaceful side, this kind of caring father. Now, admittedly, Phyllis, his wife, I'd say did most of the work, but, the two girls have really lovely memories of.
Oh, it's wonder. I mean, just to go back on your last point, I mean, the resilience of somebody to be so ostracized, and then to, the survivor in him to go to retrain, to go to England, and then to go and to the contribution he made even in his psychiatry work, the way he worked through that, and then to come back again. I mean, he embodied what public service is meant to be, right? But yeah, I have to say what was so lovely, and the parts that I didn't know about his life, to learn about the personal family life and what that great love affair was like, and the fact that he had so much joy in being a father and in the domestic life. And obviously going back to the west of Ireland was hugely important for him and his wife. I love the clip where Susan and Ruth are talking about when they'd get all in the car and they'd pack everything up and they'd be heading down the road. And then at some point they'd hit a corner and he'd say, Phyllis, will we go? And then they'd have a debate and then they'd head back to Connemara. Yeah. I mean, there's something so beautiful with that.
He loved Connemara, and, the latter part of his life, they built this, didn't build it, but renovated this cottage on the sea in Connemara, and that really was where his heart was. And it's beautiful, and it's still there today. And actually, when we were making the film, Susan and Ruth were having to face all those kind of grown-up things about, do we sell the cottage? What do we do with it? And thankfully they have held on to it. I mean, it's like a national monument, I think, now. And what's lovely about the cottage is nothing's changed. You can feel his spirit and Phyllis's spirit in the cottage. And I think that says everything about him. And, later in life, one of his great friends would be President Higgins, who often visited him there and would see him as a great inspiration. Interestingly, I was recently out in the Oras talking with President Higgins in his study, his office, and over the fireplace is this big portrait of Noël Browne, and I think that speaks to his influence even today. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I agree with what you said earlier on. he has been largely forgotten. And having a film like this that tells the truth of him, because at the end of the day, the way he's been written about, it essentially was propaganda, because you measure somebody on their actions, not just on their words. And considering that he did essentially eradicate TB in Ireland, that he built all of those hospitals, that the legacy of his work and his commitment is with us today. And what we were able to do as a country in the 60s and expand in the 60s as a result of what the health policy he put in place in the late 40s and early 50s is extraordinary. And to have people reminded of that is so important. I did wonder, I was going to ask you, had you ever thought about ever doing a feature film on?
Yeah, it's still very much kind of in my mind. Yeah, I'm just trying to find my way into it, but I think absolutely, and I think this little campaign that was born last year after the broadcast about possibly naming the new children's hospital after him. I think that would make absolute sense. And he's very much, he's a man for this time. And the film is only part of it, but I think there is a general kind of rediscovery of him and his values. And Against the Tide, obviously I read it, recently a couple of times, obviously, but it's so vibrant, and it seems so accurate even in today's environment. And he, the fact that his early political life as a young minister was in the 40s, I mean, that's a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, we owe him a debt of gratitude. And you're right to have his name there. I mean, you could think of all the issues: housing, healthcare, divorce, all of the different things, equality, end of corporal punishment, end of capital punishment, all of the things that he's been an architect in the sort of evolution of our psyche about realizing who we are now today and what was possible. I think there's a direct line there back to him, even to all the referendums that happened recently. I have to say, I was at the end, it was such a poignant moment when James Black asked him about his legacy, just now that we're talking about the legacy moment, and his belief that at the end, we just disappear, that's it. And it's kind of extraordinary that now that we're starting to see, like, the magnitude of the legacy of his life. So I just want to say, even on a personal note, thank you so much for this film. I will never forget the first time I watched it. I was so moved by it. It's an extraordinary document. It is so timeless. I know we'll look back on this in 20 and 30 years' time and be able to reference it. So thank you so much. And I'd love to share the news with everybody that we are going to have Alan in Washington, D.C. for the festival with a screening of Paul Muldoon, Leahy is Lyricy, A Life in Lyrics. Can you tell us a little bit about that film? Folks, you'll be able to buy tickets to this on February the 1st. So go get your tickets. But Alan's going to give us a little intro to the film before we wrap up.
Yeah, Paul Muldoon, of course, the great Irish poet. I mean, he's lived in New York for a long time and teaches, of course, in Princeton. So he's kind of an adopted American, though he probably wouldn't say that himself. But Paul was 70 recently, and we got together some years ago, to kind of make a film together. But neither of us wanted to do a conventional, documentary where you'd see Paul walking down beaches looking thoughtful and various people popping up saying what a wonderful chap he is and all that. So we didn't want to do that. Paul he's a wonderfully imaginative, kind of radical, free-spirited poet. And we wanted to make a film something similar. He's also a man who kind of loves music, as anybody who's seen his Muldoon's Picnic, where he performs with his band Rogue Oliphant. So he is a kind of rock star monkey, though he mightn't say that. But anyway, we came up with this idea that we do a film which was kind of a life in songs, that he would write a series of lyrics, poetic lyrics about different aspects of his life. And then we'd invite various artists, both Irish and international, to interpret the song or the poem. And so it's really his life, in a number of music tracks mainly, though some poems. And, with great joy collaborating with, some wonderful Irish artists, of course, old friends of, like Moya Brennan of Clonard and Paul Brady and Irlo Linnard and Liam Wainley and Camille O'Sullivan, all names familiar to people who love Irish music, but also international people. Van Morrison, I suppose, who straddles both worlds, but also Paul Simon, Laurie Anderson, PJ Harvey, Paul McCartney, even. How could I forget Paul McCartney? But it was a kind of who's who. Paul has a lot of good friends. I remember when we first discussed who we might approach, I was quietly thinking, oh, well, if we get one of those, we'd be lucky. But of course, they all said
you got
yes.
All of them.
Yeah, there's also some of the poems there as well, performed by the likes of Liam Neeson and Ruth Negga and others. So it's kind of an unusual little film, I think. It's bilingual, half in Irish and half in English. But I think it's and also Paul's son and daughter, who are wonderful performers, perform. So I think in a kind of eccentric, offbeat way, it's a portrait of him. Not a conventional portrait, but I think you get a sense of Paul and his kind of all his wonder in it.
Oh, it's absolutely wonderful. And it's so lighthearted, but you get a sense of his life and also the incredible journey of his life from growing up in the north of Ireland, going to the UK, coming to America, and all of the people involved in his life. And then you get the richness of the Irish language, which is so important to him. So yeah, I really think the community is going to love this film. And the fact that we get to have you on the ground is such a privilege, Alan. So
I'm
book
really
your tickets.
Do book your tickets. Yeah, sorry, I'm missing the point. Book your tickets. But many years ago, in the 90s, I made a film about Washington D.C. with Gore Vidal. So it's always, I spent about 3 months there, and so Washington,
wow,
very strong draw for me. I have very, very fond memories of those days.
Oh, that's wonderful. When was that, Alan?
I think it was maybe 95. The only reason I'm bad on dates, but the only reason I remember vividly filming with Gore Vidal in the White House during Clinton's first term, and the news came through, that Jackie Kennedy, who was, of course, a close friend of Gore's, had died. And I remember that moment standing literally in the West Wing and the news. And I remember Gore saying, I think it was almost when he discovered his own kind of frailty and, vulnerabilities. He said, because he would have had great times with Jackie, in the White House. And he said, it seems like an era's ending. I thought it only just begun. And so I can always tie the date. I think that was 95, but yeah. I can always tie the film down to that date. But it was, it was a real privilege. And Gore Vidal, as everybody knows, was, it was interesting. He was kind of brilliant talking about Washington, D.C. as a kind of Disneyland. But, he was funny and he was sharp and he was intelligent, all of which you expect. But he was also incredibly warm and, really fond memories of the 3 months we spent in Washington. So it's always lovely to get back.
Wonderful. What a perfect way. We've come full circle. Now we're going to be having you coming over. That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. I didn't know that you had been over here doing that. So we're thrilled. So on behalf of our partners, NYUDC Dialogues and the Solas Nua team here, I just want to say thank you so much, Alan. We're deeply, deeply grateful to you for the film and for sharing your stories here today. And we're so looking forward to seeing you March 1st in DC.
So yeah, and thanks for your kind words, and looking forward to seeing you all in person. And as Maeve says, book the tickets. Book the tickets.
The tickets. Ihawa.
Thank you.